The wind screamed across Eagle's Peak like a banshee, carrying snow so thick it turned the world into a white nightmare. Marcus Chen pressed against the cliff face, his breath forming ice crystals on his beard as he spotted movement below. A family of 4, stumbling through knee-deep drifts, the children's cries barely audible over the storm. Most people would see a tragedy unfolding. Marcus saw something else entirely. For 15 years, he'd lived alone on this mountain, hiding from a past that involved government secrets and a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power. The family below was dying, hypothermia claiming them one frozen breath at a time, but Marcus knew something they didn't. Something about this exact location that could change everything. 20 feet beneath where they struggled, buried under decades of snow and rock, lay the answers to the biggest financial scandal in American history. The evidence that could topple dynasties and free the innocent. The same evidence that had put a bounty on Marcus's head. Should he reveal himself and risk everything to save strangers, or let them perish to protect a secret worth billions? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus watched the father collapse, his body hitting the snow like a felled tree. The mother screamed, dropping to her knees beside him, while 2 small figures, children no older than 8 or 10, huddled against her back. The storm was merciless, and Marcus knew they had minutes, not hours. 15 years of isolation had taught him many things, but it hadn't erased his humanity. He cursed under his breath, knowing what this decision would cost him. The moment he showed his face, the careful life he'd built would crumble. Satellite imagery, facial recognition, digital footprints, they'd find him within days. But those children's cries cut through his defenses like a blade. Marcus pulled his hood tight and began his descent, moving with the sure-footed grace of someone who knew every rock and crevice. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he approached the family. The mother looked up at his approach, her eyes wide with desperate hope and primitive fear. "Please," she gasped, her lips already blue with cold. "My husband. He can't. The children." "I'm here to help," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. He knelt beside the unconscious man, checking his pulse, weak but present. "What are your names?" "Sarah Bennett," the woman managed. "This is David, my husband. Emma and Jake." She gestured to the children, both shivering violently despite their winter coats. Bennett. The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd memorized thousands of names over the years, but this one burned bright in his memory. David Bennett, the whistleblower who'd tried to expose the Meridian financial conspiracy 3 years ago before disappearing into witness protection. "Why are you up here?" Marcus asked, though pieces were already clicking into place. "Running," Sarah whispered. "They found us again. David said there was evidence hidden somewhere on this mountain, something that could end this nightmare. We were trying to reach the old mining station when the storm hit." Marcus felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders like fresh snow. After 15 years of hiding, the conspiracy had literally stumbled onto his doorstep. The evidence David Bennett sought wasn't just hidden on the mountain. It was directly beneath them, in a waterproof case that Marcus had buried in 2009, the night before he faked his own death. "Can you walk?" he asked David, who was stirring back to consciousness. David's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Marcus with difficulty. "Someone who knows what you're looking for," Marcus said quietly, "and why people want you dead for seeking it." He helped David to his feet, noting the man's surprised strength. Bennett was tougher than he looked. He'd have to be to survive this long while being hunted by some of the most powerful people in the country. "My cabin's a 1/4 mile north," Marcus said, pointing through the swirling snow. "We need to move now, before hypothermia takes hold." As they began walking, Emma tugged at his coat. "Mister, are you a mountain ghost?" Marcus almost smiled. "Something like that." The trek to his cabin felt endless, each step a negotiation with the howling wind. Marcus led them along paths invisible to untrained eyes, around crevasses and over hidden streams. Behind them, their footprints disappeared within minutes, erased by the relentless snow. When the cabin finally emerged from the white curtain ahead, a sturdy structure built into the mountainside itself, Sarah Bennett wept with relief. Inside, warmth from a wood-burning stove enveloped them. Marcus distributed blankets and hot coffee while the family thawed, but his mind was racing, calculating risks and possibilities. David Bennett had spent 3 years running from the truth that Marcus had guarded for 15. Now, with the storm raging outside and powerful enemies surely tracking them, Marcus faced an impossible choice. Tell them about the evidence buried beneath the snow and risk unleashing a war that could destroy them all, or stay silent and watch an innocent family remain forever hunted. The wind rattled the cabin windows like skeletal fingers, and Marcus realized that after 15 years of hiding, it was time to choose a side. The cabin materialized from the white chaos like something conjured from desperation itself. Elena pressed her face against the frost-covered window of their stalled SUV, certain her mind was playing tricks. But there it was, a rough-hewn structure of weathered logs, smoke curling impossibly from its chimney despite being miles from any marked trail. "Mom, I can't feel my fingers," Mia whispered from the back seat, her voice barely audible over the wind that had been battering their vehicle for the past hour. "Just a little longer, baby." Elena's breath formed crystals in the frigid air. The heater had died 20 minutes after the engine, and now the cold was seeping through every seal, every crack. She turned to her husband. "David, we have to try for that cabin." David stared through the windshield, his lawyer's mind calculating odds the way he always did. "It's got to be 200 yards, in this wind, with the kids. We'll die if we stay here." The words came out harsher than she intended, but the truth had a way of cutting through politeness. Jake, their 12-year-old, hadn't spoken in 10 minutes. That scared her more than the cold. The decision made itself. Within moments, they were stumbling through knee-deep snow, David carrying Jake, while Elena pulled Mia along. The wind seemed determined to erase them, each gust threatening to tear them away from each other. Elena lost sight of the cabin twice, panic clawing at her throat until David's voice cut through the storm, guiding them forward. The door swung open before they reached it. "Get inside, now." The voice belonged to a young man, maybe 17, with dark hair and eyes that seemed far older than his years. He stepped back as they tumbled into the warmth, their bodies shaking uncontrollably. Elena's first coherent thought was how impossible this all seemed. The cabin's interior was meticulously maintained, hand-carved furniture, a stone fireplace throwing dancing shadows across knotted pine walls, shelves lined with books and supplies. This wasn't some abandoned hunting shack. Someone lived here. "Sit by the fire," the boy said, already moving with practiced efficiency. He handed them thick wool blankets that smelled of cedar and wood smoke. "Don't warm up too fast, you'll shock your system." "Thank you," David managed through chattering teeth. "I'm David Hartwell. This is my wife Elena, our kids Jake and Mia. We were trying to reach Summit Lodge when the storm caught you on Bear Creek Road," the boy finished. "People always underestimate how fast weather changes up here." He poured steaming liquid from a pot into 4 metal cups. "Drink this slowly. It's pine needle tea, has vitamin C, and it'll help with the cold." Elena studied their rescuer as feeling gradually returned to her extremities. He moved around the cabin with the confidence of someone completely at home in this wilderness, but something about him seemed off. His clothes, while practical, looked expensive. The books on his shelves weren't the usual hunting magazines and pulp novels you'd expect in a mountain cabin. She spotted titles on geology, mining history, and what looked like legal texts. "What's your name?" Mia asked, her natural curiosity overriding her exhaustion. "Call me Aaron." He hesitated just long enough that Elena caught it. "I've been living up here for a while. Where are your parents?" Jake had finally found his voice. Another hesitation. "It's just me now." David's lawyer instincts were kicking in despite the circumstances. Elena could see him cataloguing details, questions forming. A teenager living alone in an isolated cabin, clearly well supplied and educated. None of it added up to anything innocent. "The storm should break by morning," Aaron continued, deflecting any follow-up questions. "Radio says it'll be clear enough for rescue crews to get through. You're safe here." But Elena wasn't sure they were safe at all. As warmth returned to her body, her mind began working more clearly. The cabin's location was too perfect, too convenient. Aaron's demeanor was too controlled for someone his age, and there was something in his eyes when he looked at them. Not just concern, but calculation. "How long have you been living here?" David asked. "Long enough to know these mountains better than anyone." Aaron stirred the fire, sparks spiraling up the chimney. "Long enough to know that sometimes people come looking for things they shouldn't." The words hung in the air like a warning. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather they'd escaped. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, as if the storm itself was trying to keep them trapped in this place, with this strange boy and whatever secrets he was harboring. Aaron turned from the fire, and in the flickering light, his expression had changed completely. Gone was the helpful teenager who'd saved them from the blizzard. In his place stood someone harder, older, carrying burdens that Elena suddenly realized might be more dangerous than the storm they'd fled. The cave mouth yawned before them like a hungry beast, black and forbidding against the white fury of the storm. Sarah hesitated at the threshold, her maternal instincts warring with desperation. The mysterious boy, Kyle, he'd said his name was, stood silhouetted against the swirling snow, his lean frame somehow radiating confidence despite his youth. "Trust me," he said simply, as if reading her thoughts. "It's warm inside." Mark stumbled forward, Emma's weight becoming too much for his exhausted body. The decision made itself. Sarah grabbed Tommy's hand and followed Kyle into the darkness. The change was immediate and startling. Within 20 feet, the howling wind faded to a whisper, and the temperature rose noticeably. The cave curved sharply to the right, blocking the entrance from view. Kyle produced a small LED flashlight, its beam revealing smooth stone walls that seemed almost polished. "How is it so warm?" Mark asked, setting Emma down gently. Their daughter's lips were still blue, but her shivering had lessened. "Geothermal," Kyle replied, though something in his tone suggested there was more to it. "The whole mountain's got hot springs running through it. Most people don't know about this place." As they moved deeper into the cave, the passage widened into a chamber large enough to stand upright. Kyle's flashlight swept across the space, revealing something that made Sarah's breath catch. The walls weren't naturally smooth. They bore the unmistakable marks of human tools. This wasn't just a cave, it was a tunnel. "What is this place?" she whispered. Kyle's flashlight beam froze on the wall. For a moment, he seemed younger than his apparent 16 years, uncertainty flickering across his weathered features. "It's complicated." Mark was busy tending to Emma, rubbing her hands between his own, but Tommy stepped closer to examine the walls. "Dad, look at these marks. Someone carved this out." "A long time ago," Kyle said quickly. "Miners. Gold miners from way back." But Sarah noticed the hesitation, the way his eyes darted away when he spoke. She'd been a prosecutor before they'd moved to Colorado, seeking a simpler life. She knew when someone was holding back the truth. The tunnel continued deeper into the mountain, and Kyle led them forward with the confidence of someone who'd walked this path many times. After another 100 yards, they emerged into a natural chamber that took Sarah's breath away. A small hot spring bubbled in one corner, filling the space with blessed warmth and humidity. More telling were the signs of habitation: a sleeping bag, canned goods stacked neatly against one wall, and what looked like a camp stove. "You live here," Mark said. It wasn't a question. Kyle nodded, setting down his pack. "Sometimes, when I need to." "Where are your parents?" Sarah asked gently. The boy's jaw tightened. "Gone." Emma had stopped shivering and was looking around with wide eyes. "It's like a secret hideout," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in hours. "Something like that." Kyle muttered, busying himself with lighting the camp stove. "You should get out of those wet clothes. I've got some extra stuff that might fit." As the family began to strip off their frozen outer layers, Sarah watched Kyle carefully. He moved with purpose, but she caught him glancing repeatedly at a section of the chamber wall where shadows gathered thickest. Something was there, something he didn't want them to see. "Kyle," she said as he handed her a wool blanket that smelled of wood smoke, "how long have you been living on your own?" 3 months, he replied, then seemed to realize he'd revealed more than intended. "That's when the Barrett murders happened," Tommy said suddenly. Everyone turned to stare at him. "What?" "I read the news. That mining executive and his family killed in their cabin about 20 miles from here. They never caught who did it." The color drained from Kyle's face. "That's got nothing to do with me." But Sarah saw the fear in his eyes, the way his hands shook slightly as he poured hot soup from a thermos. "Kyle, are you in some kind of trouble?" For a long moment, the only sound was the bubbling of the hot spring and the distant moan of wind through the tunnel entrance. Then Kyle set down the thermos and looked directly at her. "The people who killed the Barretts," he said quietly. "They're still out there, and they're looking for something the Barretts hid before they died." "How do you know that?" Mark asked, instinctively pulling Emma closer. Kyle walked to the shadowed section of wall that had drawn his attention earlier. He pressed something, a hidden lever or switch, and part of the rock face swung inward with a grinding sound. Beyond was another chamber, and in the faint light that spilled from their sanctuary, Sarah could see the glint of metal. Lots of metal. "Because," Kyle said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know where they hid it." The warmth from the cave's depths seemed impossible, as if they'd stumbled into a pocket of summer buried beneath tons of frozen rock. Sarah pulled off her soaked gloves with trembling fingers, watching steam rise from her wet clothing. The temperature difference was so dramatic it made her dizzy. "How is this place so warm?" David asked, his voice echoing strangely in the expanding cavern. Kai moved ahead without answering, his flashlight beam dancing across walls that seemed to shimmer with an odd greenish tint. The passage curved sharply to the right, opening into a vast chamber that took Sarah's breath away. Natural formations jutted from floor and ceiling like the ribs of some ancient beast, and in the center, a small pool of water reflected their lights with mirror-like clarity. "Geothermal activity," Kai said simply, kneeling beside the pool and cupping water in his hands. He drank deeply, then looked up at them. "Safe to drink. The mountain feeds it from deep springs." Emma had stopped shivering for the first time in hours. She wandered toward one of the rock formations, running her small hand along its surface. "It's like a castle," she whispered. Sarah knelt beside the pool, grateful for water that didn't require melting snow. As she drank, she studied their rescuer more carefully. His clothes were well made but worn, his boots expensive hiking gear that had seen serious use. Most telling were his hands, calloused from outdoor work, but his fingernails were clean, and there was something deliberate about the way he moved, like someone trained in precision. "You said you'd been waiting for us," David said, setting down his pack. "What did you mean?" Kai's expression grew guarded. He pulled a small bundle from his jacket, dried meat wrapped in cloth, and offered it to Emma. "People have been searching these mountains for weeks, not rescue teams. Others. What kind of others?" Sarah's stomach clenched. "The kind that don't advertise their presence." Kai settled cross-legged on a flat rock. "The kind that carry military-grade equipment and ask very specific questions about a family from Denver." David went rigid. "How do you know we're from Denver?" "Because they've been showing your pictures around, all of you." Kai's eyes moved between them. "They're very interested in finding you before anyone else does." Sarah felt the cave's warmth turn oppressive. "We don't understand. We're just a normal family. David works in accounting, I teach elementary school. There's nothing special about us." "Maybe not about you." Kai pulled out a water bottle and refilled it from the pool. "But something tells me you're connected to something that isn't normal at all." Emma had wandered deeper into the cave, her voice floating back to them. "Mummy, there are pictures on the walls." Sarah hurried after her daughter, David close behind. Emma stood before a section of cave wall where the rock face was unusually smooth. In the beam of Sarah's flashlight, she could make out marks that definitely weren't natural formations. "Are those drawings?" David asked. Kai appeared beside them, his expression unreadable. "Markings, been here longer than anyone remembers." But as Sarah looked closer, she realized they weren't ancient cave paintings. The marks were more recent, carved symbols, numbers, and what looked like a rough map. Her heart stopped as she recognized something among the carved lines. Coordinates that matched exactly the ones from Robert's letter. "You know what these mean," she said to Kai. It wasn't a question. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the flashlight's glow. "The question is whether you do." David stepped forward. "Look, we appreciate the shelter, but we need to get to the ranger station. Our car broke down and—" "Your car didn't break down," Kai interrupted. "It was sabotaged. I found it 3 hours ago. Professional job. Engine disabled, tires slashed, but made to look like weather damage." The cave suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in. Sarah pulled Emma closer. "That's impossible. The same people who've been asking questions. They knew you were coming." Kai turned to face them fully. "The real question is why you're here at all. Most people don't venture into these mountains in winter without a very good reason." Sarah exchanged a glance with David. Everything was unraveling too fast. Their simple mission to understand Robert's letter becoming something far more dangerous. "We had family business," David said carefully. "Family business that gets people killed." Kai moved to the cave entrance, listening to something they couldn't hear. When he returned, his expression was grim. "We need to go deeper. Now." "What? Why?" "Because they found the cave. He was already gathering their packs, and they're not here to offer you a warm meal and safe passage out." Sarah heard it then, the distant sound of voices, multiple people moving through the snow outside. Emma pressed against her leg, sensing the sudden tension. "There's another way out?" David asked, hefting his pack. Kai's smile was sharp in the flashlight beam. "There's a way to everything. Question is whether you're ready for where it leads." The voices were getting closer. The old mining tunnels stretched deeper into the mountain than Sarah had imagined possible. Their footsteps echoed off wet stone walls as Kyle led them through a maze of passages, his torch casting dancing shadows that made the carved rock seem alive. The air grew warmer with each step, and she could feel the tension leaving her children's shoulders as they walked between her and David. "How do you know about this place?" David asked, his voice still hoarse from the cold. Kyle glanced back, his dark eyes unreadable. "My grandfather brought me here when I was younger than your boy, said it was our responsibility to watch over it." Emma tugged at Sarah's coat. "Mom, look at the walls." Sarah lifted her head and gasped. The tunnel walls were covered in strange markings, not random scratches, but deliberate carvings. Symbols and numbers, some fresh, others worn smooth by time and moisture. Between them, names were etched into the stone, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. "What is this?" she whispered. "A record," Kyle said simply. "Everyone who's ever found their way down here, everyone who's ever needed shelter." He paused at a junction where 3 passages branched off. "My family's been keeping track for 3 generations." Tommy ran his fingers along one section of wall. "Look, some of these are really old. This one says 1847. The original miners." Kyle nodded. "But they weren't the first to use these caves." He led them down the leftmost passage, and the air grew noticeably warmer. Sarah could hear something ahead, a faint rushing sound like distant water. The tunnel opened into a natural cavern, and she stopped in amazement. A hot spring bubbled up from somewhere deep in the mountain, forming a steaming pool before disappearing into a crack in the far wall. The cavern was larger than her entire house, with a ceiling that vanished into darkness above their heads. But what made her breath catch was what surrounded the spring. Crates, dozens of wooden crates, stacked along the walls like cordwood. Some looked ancient, their wood darkened with age. Others appeared newer, their surfaces still bearing shipping marks and company logos. Between them, canvas bags bulged with unknown contents. "What is all this?" David stepped toward the nearest stack. "Don't!" Kyle's voice cut sharp through the cavern. "Not yet." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Kyle, what aren't you telling us?" The boy, because that's what he was, she realized, probably no older than 16 despite his mountain-hardened appearance, set down his torch and turned to face them. His expression was older than his years, weighted with something she couldn't identify. "You asked how I knew you were out there. Truth is, I was watching the road. I've been watching it for weeks, waiting for them to come back." Kyle gestured at the crates. "This isn't just a shelter, it's a cache. Gold, silver cache, enough to buy a small city. And there are people who know it's here." David's face had gone pale. "How much trouble are we in?" "Kind that gets people killed." Kyle walked to one of the newer crates and lifted the lid just enough for them to see inside. Even in the flickering torchlight, the gold bars gleamed like captured sunlight. 3 weeks ago, a man came through town asking questions. Said he was a geologist, but he had the wrong kind of eyes for a scientist. 2 days later, old Henrik was found dead in his cabin. They made it look like a heart attack, but Henrik was tougher than leather. Sarah pulled her children closer. "Henrik knew about this place?" "Henrik's grandfather helped my great-grandfather establish the cache. We were partners, guardians. The gold comes from dozens of sources, miners who needed somewhere safe to store their findings, people fleeing with family fortunes, even some government money that got lost during the war years." Tommy stared at the crates with wide eyes. "It's like pirate treasure." "More dangerous than pirate treasure," Kyle said grimly. "Pirates are dead. The people who want this are very much alive, and they have resources, military training, government connections, corporate backing. They've been hunting for this cache for decades." Emma's voice was small. "Are we safe here?" Kyle knelt down to her level. "For now. The storm will keep them away tonight, maybe tomorrow. But they'll be back, and when they come, they won't be alone." Sarah felt the weight of their situation settling over her like a heavy blanket. They'd escaped the storm only to walk into something infinitely more dangerous. "So what do we do?" "We prepare," Kyle said, standing and looking at each of them in turn. "Because ready or not, you're part of this now, and these people don't leave witnesses." The hot spring bubbled peacefully in the background, its warmth a stark contrast to the ice forming in Sarah's veins. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but she was beginning to understand that the real storm was just beginning. The warmth of the cave felt like stepping into another world. Sarah pulled Emma and Jake closer as Marcus led them deeper into the rocky passage, his torch casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The howling wind outside became a distant memory, replaced by an almost cathedral-like silence. "How far back does this go?" David asked, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He was studying something on the cave wall, running his fingers along what looked like carved symbols. "Far enough," he said finally. "My grandfather showed me this place when I was younger than your boy there." The passage opened into a larger chamber, and Marcus began gathering dried wood from a neat pile stacked against one wall. Soon a fire crackled in a natural depression in the floor, the smoke disappearing through invisible fissures above. The family huddled around the flames, finally beginning to thaw. "You live up here alone?" Sarah asked, watching as Marcus moved with practiced efficiency around what was clearly a well-used shelter. "Mostly." Marcus pulled dried meat and some kind of root vegetables from a cache hidden behind loose rocks. "Sometimes my uncle visits, sometimes others." His eyes grew distant. "Used to be different, before the accident started." David looked up sharply. "What kind of accidents?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, feeding the fire. "Hikers getting lost in places they shouldn't get lost. Climbers falling from routes they'd climbed 100 times before. Search and rescue finding bodies in locations that didn't make sense." He glanced at David. You said you were heading to Ridgeline Peak. That's right. Research project. What kind of research? David hesitated, and Sarah could see the wheels turning in his mind. Geological survey, looking for mineral deposits. Marcus went very still. Even Emma noticed, looking up from where she'd been warming her hands by the fire. Mineral deposits, Marcus repeated slowly. On Ridgeline Peak. Is there a problem with that? David asked, but his tone had changed, become more careful. Marcus stood and walked to the far end of the chamber where the shadows were deepest. When he returned, he was carrying something wrapped in oiled cloth. He sat cross-legged by the fire and slowly unwrapped what appeared to be an old journal, its leather cover cracked with age. My grandfather kept records, Marcus said. Everything that happened in these mountains, he wrote down, including what he found in 1987. The family leaned closer as Marcus opened the journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. Even from where she sat, Sarah could see dense handwriting interspersed with hand-drawn maps and diagrams. Gold? Jake asked, his 12-year-old mind jumping to the obvious. Marcus smiled grimly. Better than gold, rare earth elements, lithium, neodymium, europium, the kind of stuff that makes cell phones and electric car batteries work, the kind of stuff countries go to war over. David's face had gone pale. How much? Enough to buy a small nation. Marcus turned a page, revealing a detailed map of the mountain range. The main deposit is here, in a network of caves below Ridgeline Peak. My grandfather estimated it was worth about $30 billion. That was in 1987 money. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Why didn't he report it? He tried. Marcus's voice became hard, filed the proper claims, went through all the legal channels. 3 weeks later, his cabin burned down with him inside. Accident, they said. Faulty propane heater. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but it seemed less important now. The company your husband works for, Marcus continued, looking directly at Sarah, Meridian Industries. They've been sniffing around these mountains for years, buying up land through shell companies, bribing officials, making problems disappear. How do you know who I work for? David demanded. Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a smartphone, its screen cracked but functional. Satellite internet. Amazing what you can find out about someone when you have their license plate number. Sarah's heart was pounding. David, what is he talking about? But David wasn't looking at her anymore. His attention was fixed on Marcus, and there was something in his expression that Sarah had never seen before, something calculating and cold. The geological survey, she said slowly, the pieces falling into place. It wasn't university research, was it? I can explain, David started, but Marcus was already moving, closing the journal and backing toward the shadows at the rear of the cave. No need, Marcus said. I think I understand the situation perfectly now. The fire seemed to dim, and Sarah realized that their rescue had just become something far more dangerous. Outside, the storm raged on, but the real danger was no longer the weather. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline world that sparkled under the emerging sun. Elena watched through the cabin's frosted window as Marcus led her children outside, their laughter echoing across the snow-covered clearing. For the first time in months, they looked like children again, not the frightened, hungry waifs they'd become during their desperate flight. They're safe here, Kai said, appearing beside her with 2 steaming cups of pine needle tea, for now. Elena accepted the cup gratefully, letting the warmth seep through her fingers. You keep saying, for now. What aren't you telling me? Kai's jaw tightened as he stared out at the pristine landscape. My grandfather left me more than just survival skills. He left me a responsibility. He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. There are things hidden in these mountains, things that powerful people would kill for. Before Elena could respond, a sharp whistle cut through the morning air. Kai's entire body went rigid, his hand instinctively moving to the knife at his belt. Get the children inside, he commanded, his voice low and urgent. Now. Elena didn't hesitate. Years of running had taught her to recognize real danger. She pushed open the cabin door and called out, keeping her tone light despite the fear creeping up her spine. "Sophie, Danny, come help me with breakfast." Marcus immediately sensed the shift in atmosphere. He herded the children toward the cabin without question, his reporter-esque instincts picking up on the tension radiating from both Elena and Kai. As soon as they were inside, Kai barred the door and moved to a wooden chest in the corner. He pulled out what looked like an old military radio, its surface scarred and weathered. "Eagle's Nest, this is Wolf Pup." He spoke into the device, his voice barely above a whisper. "Confirm your position." Static crackled for several seconds before a gravelly voice responded. "Wolf Pup, you've got company coming up the South Ridge. 3 vehicles, armed. ETA 20 minutes. Elena felt her blood turn to ice. "They found us." "Not you," Kai said grimly, switching off the radio. "Me. But since you're here—" He trailed off, then seemed to make a decision. Moving to another section of the cabin, he pressed against what looked like a solid wooden panel. It swung inward, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside were documents, maps, and what appeared to be geological surveys. But what caught Elena's attention were the photographs, images of a massive underground cavern filled with gleaming metallic deposits. "Rare earth minerals," Kai explained, gathering the materials quickly. "Worth billions. My grandfather discovered the deposits 40 years ago, but he knew what would happen if word got out. The mining companies would destroy everything, the land, the wildlife, the sacred sites of his people." Marcus whistled low, so he kept it secret. "Until recently, someone leaked information about the location. Now there are 3 different corporations trying to claim the land, and they're not being polite about it." Danny pressed closer to his mother. "Are the bad men coming for us again?" Elena smoothed his hair, her mind racing. "Maybe, sweetheart, but we're going to be smart about this." Kai stuffed the documents into a waterproof pack. "There's a back trail that leads deeper into the mountains. I know places they'll never find us." "Running again," Sophie muttered, her young face etched with exhaustion that belonged on someone much older. "Sometimes running is the smartest thing you can do," Marcus said gently. "I've seen what these corporate types are capable of when there's this much money involved." Another whistle echoed from outside, closer this time. Kai moved to the window and peered through a gap in the boards he'd quickly nailed over the glass. 2 trucks, black SUV, he reported, men with rifles, professional. Elena felt the familiar surge of protective fury that had kept her family alive through months of running. "What do they want from you specifically?" "The location of the main deposit. My grandfather was the only one who knew exactly where it was, and he passed that knowledge to me before he died." Kai shouldered his pack and grabbed a pair of snowshoes. "They think they can torture it out of me. Then we make sure they don't get the chance," Elena said firmly. Kai looked surprised by her resolve. "This isn't your fight." "We made it our fight when we accepted your help," Marcus replied. "Besides, I've been looking for a story that matters. This sounds like it." The sound of engines grew louder, accompanied by voices shouting orders. Kai moved to the back of the cabin and opened a concealed door that led to a narrow tunnel. "This connects to a cave system about half a mile away," he explained. "From there, we can reach the high country where vehicles can't follow." As they prepared to leave, Elena took one last look at the cabin that had sheltered them. It represented safety, warmth, hope, things that seemed to slip away every time she thought she'd found them. "Ready?" Kai asked. Elena gathered her children close. "Ready." They disappeared into the tunnel just as the first boots hit the cabin's front porch. The cave felt smaller, with 5 people huddled around the dying embers. Sarah watched Kale's face in the flickering light, studying the sharp angles that seemed carved from the mountain itself. He'd been quiet since revealing the existence of others who knew about the gold, his earlier warmth replaced by a watchful tension that made her stomach clench. "How many others?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma and Michael slept fitfully against the far wall, wrapped in every spare piece of clothing they could find. Kyle poked at the fire with a charred stick. Hard to say. The corporation that's been buying up land around here, Meridian Holdings, they've got people, mercenaries mostly. Some locals they've bought off. He glanced up, his pale eyes reflecting the flames. My grandfather thought he was being clever, leaving clues only family would understand. He didn't count on someone torturing those clues out of his brother before he died. Sarah's blood chilled. Torturing? Uncle Ezra lasted 3 days before he broke, told them about the journal, the markers, everything he knew. Kyle's jaw tightened. They dumped his body in a ravine 20 miles from here, made it look like a climbing accident. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the cave walls. Outside, the wind had died to an occasional moan, but Sarah could hear something else now. A distant mechanical drone that seemed to pulse with the storm. "What is that?" she whispered. Kyle was already moving, grabbing his pack and pulling out what looked like military-grade binoculars. "Helicopter, they're searching." He crawled toward the cave mouth, staying low. Should be impossible to fly in this weather, but Meridian's got resources. David joined him at the entrance, peering out into the swirling white. "Maybe it's search and rescue looking for us?" SAR choppers don't fly at night in blizzard conditions, and they don't use infrared arrays. Kyle adjusted the binoculars, his face grim. "That's military hardware. They're scanning for heat signatures." The mechanical drone grew louder, seeming to hover somewhere above them. Sarah felt exposed despite the tons of rock overhead. She moved to wake the children, but Kyle held up a hand. "Don't the fires too small to register through this much stone, and the cave mouth faces away from their search pattern?" He watched for several more minutes as the sound circled their position. "They're working a grid, professional." "How do they even know we're here?" Sarah asked. "Your car. They probably found it by now, ran the plates. Once they figured out who you are, they'd have called in favors with local law enforcement, told them you were missing persons, maybe suspected of something that would justify the search." Kyle lowered the binoculars. "These people are good at making their hunts look legitimate." The helicopter sound began to fade, moving further down the valley. David slumped against the cave wall. "This is insane. We just wanted to get home." "You're part of it now," Kyle said simply. "The moment I showed you that nugget, the moment you learned what's up here, you became a threat to a billion-dollar operation." Sarah felt the weight of that statement settle over her like a physical thing. "So, what are our options?" "We can try to wait them out. Storm should clear by tomorrow afternoon, but they'll have ground teams by then, blocking every trail down." Kyle pulled out his grandfather's journal, running his thumb over the cracked leather cover. "Or we can go deeper into the mountains, follow the trail to its end, the gold mine. More than that, my grandfather was paranoid about claim jumpers and government seizures. The main cache isn't in any mine. It's hidden somewhere even I haven't figured out yet. But the journal has the final clues." He looked between Sarah and David. "If we can get there first, we might have leverage, something to trade for our lives." David shook his head. "This is crazy. We should surrender, tell them we don't want any part of their gold. Just let us go." "You think they'll risk it?" Kyle's laugh was bitter. "These aren't businessmen worried about bad publicity. Meridian's got military contracts worth hundreds of millions. They can't afford witnesses to their methods." The cave fell silent except for the children's steady breathing. Sarah stared into the dying fire, weighing impossible choices. Stay and hope to hide until rescue came, if rescue was even coming. Surrender and trust in the mercy of people who'd already committed murder, or follow a mountain boy deeper into the wilderness, chasing a treasure that might not even exist. "How long would it take," she asked finally, "to reach this cache?" Kyle consulted the journal, tracing routes with his finger. 2 days if the weather clears, maybe 3 with the children. He looked up at her. "It won't be easy. The terrain gets rougher the higher we go." Outside, the helicopter sound was returning, closer this time. Sarah made her choice. The wind howled through the trees like a banshee as Marcus led them deeper into the wilderness, his lantern casting dancing shadows across the snow-laden branches. Sarah pulled Emma closer, feeling her daughter's small body shivering despite the layers of clothing they'd wrapped around her. Behind them, David struggled to keep pace, his breath forming crystalline clouds in the frigid air. "How much farther?" Sarah called out, her voice barely audible above the storm. Marcus turned, his weathered face barely visible beneath his hood. "Not far now, but we need to move faster. They won't be far behind." The mention of their pursuers sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the temperature. She'd seen the cold determination in those men's eyes back at the cabin, the way they'd methodically searched through their belongings as if they owned everything they touched. Whatever this treasure was that Marcus spoke of, people were willing to kill for it. They pressed on through the deepening snow, following what appeared to be an ancient deer path that wound between towering pines. Marcus moved with the sure-footed confidence of someone who'd traveled these routes countless times, never hesitating at the numerous forks and branches that appeared in their path. "Tell us about your grandfather," David said suddenly, his lawyer's mind clearly working to piece together the puzzle. "How did he really find this gold?" Marcus was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if he'd heard the question over the wind. Finally, he spoke without turning around. "My grandfather wasn't like other men. He could read the mountain like most folks read books. Said the earth spoke to him, told him where to look." "That's not an answer," David pressed. This time Marcus did stop, turning to face them with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. "You want the truth? Fine. My grandfather was part of a surveying team back in 1952. Government operation, all very hush-hush. They were mapping mineral deposits for the military, looking for strategic resources in case of war." Emma stumbled, and Sarah caught her arm, helping her daughter maintain her footing on the treacherous path. "They found something up here that wasn't supposed to exist," Marcus continued. "A gold vein so pure and so vast that it could have destabilized the entire economy if word got out. The government classified the findings, buried the reports, and reassigned the entire team to different corners of the country. But your grandfather kept records," Sarah said, understanding beginning to dawn. "More than that. He kept samples and maps." Marcus's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "When he was dying, he told me everything. Made me promise to protect the secret. Said too many people had already died for it." A branch cracked somewhere behind them, and they all froze. The sound was too sharp, too deliberate to be natural. Marcus immediately extinguished his lantern, plunging them into the grey twilight of the storm. "This way," he whispered urgently. "Stay low and follow my voice." They moved like ghosts through the trees, Sarah's heart pounding so loudly she was certain their pursuers would hear it. Emma's breathing had become labored, and Sarah could feel her daughter's strength ebbing with each step. They needed shelter soon, or the cold would finish what their enemies had started. Marcus led them up a steep embankment, their boots slipping on ice-covered rocks. Sarah's lungs burned as she fought for each breath in the thin air. Just when she thought she couldn't take another step, Marcus stopped before what appeared to be a solid wall of granite. "In here," he said, and Sarah realized he was indicating a narrow crevice in the rock face, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways. They slipped through the opening one by one, finding themselves in a small cave that extended back into darkness. Marcus waited until they were all inside before relighting his lantern, revealing smooth walls that showed signs of human habitation. Old camping gear sat stacked in one corner, and someone had built a small fire ring near the entrance. "One of your grandfather's camps?" David asked. "One of mine," Marcus replied. "I've been coming up here for years, trying to piece together his maps, following his trail markers." He moved to the back of the cave and pulled aside what looked like a natural rock formation. Behind it, carved into the stone, was a series of symbols and numbers. Sarah moved closer, studying the markings. They appeared to be coordinates, but interspersed with strange pictographs she didn't recognize. "My grandfather's code," Marcus explained. "Took me 5 years to crack it. These symbols mark the location of the main vein, but also something else, something he called the Guardian's Price. What does that mean? Emma asked weakly. Marcus's expression grew grim. It means that finding the gold is only half the battle. According to these markings, there's something protecting it, something that's already claimed the lives of everyone who's tried to take it since my grandfather's discovery. Outside, the wind suddenly died, leaving them in an ominous silence that felt more threatening than the storm. The crackling fire cast dancing shadows across the cave walls as Marcus studied the weathered map spread before them. His finger traced the faded ink lines that marked treacherous mountain passes and forgotten trails. Sarah noticed how his hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from something deeper. "My grandfather drew this 60 years ago," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was part of the original survey team that discovered the uranium deposits. What they found up there—" He paused, glancing toward the cave entrance where wind still howled. "It was enough to power half the country." David leaned closer. Emma nestled against his chest. "But if it's so valuable, why isn't it being mined?" Marcus's laugh held no humor. "Because officially, it doesn't exist. The government classified the entire discovery after the first survey team started dying off. Car accidents, house fires, hunting mishaps, all very convenient." Sarah felt ice forming in her stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Your grandfather?" "Rockslide. At least, that's what the report said." Marcus rolled up the map with practiced precision, but he'd hidden copies of everything: survey data, geological reports, even photographs of the ore samples. He knew they'd come for him eventually. The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling toward the cave ceiling. In the brief flare of light, Sarah caught sight of something metallic glinting deeper in the cave. Marcus noticed her gaze and stood, motioning for them to follow. "There's more you need to see." They ventured deeper into the mountain's belly, Marcus leading with a flashlight that cut through the darkness like a blade. The cave system was more extensive than Sarah had imagined, with passages branching off in multiple directions. Some were barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, while others opened into cathedral-sized chambers. "How do you know this place so well?" David asked, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I've been living here on and off for 3 years, Marcus replied. "Ever since they killed my father." The words hung heavy in the cold air. Sarah felt David's grip tighten around Emma, who had fallen asleep despite everything. They reached a wider chamber where Marcus had clearly made a more permanent camp. Solar-powered lanterns provided steady illumination, revealing sleeping bags, camping equipment, and several metal storage containers. But what drew Sarah's attention were the dozens of photographs pinned to a makeshift bulletin board carved into the rock face. "My father continued my grandfather's work," Marcus explained, gesturing toward the photos. "He documented everything: the mining operations that were supposed to be discontinued, the private security teams, the shell companies funneling money through offshore accounts." Sarah studied the photographs. Aerial shots of the mountain range revealed extensive excavation hidden beneath camouflaged netting. Men in military-style gear patrolled areas that should have been pristine wilderness. Corporate executives shook hands outside nondescript buildings, while briefcases changed hands. "They're still mining," she breathed. "And for decades, the uranium goes to the highest bidder, some to legitimate nuclear facilities, but most to countries and organizations that shouldn't have access to weapons-grade material." Marcus pulled down one photograph showing a convoy of unmarked trucks winding through a mountain pass. "My father got too close to exposing their transportation routes." David shifted Emma to his other arm. "So they killed him too. Made it look like he got lost in a storm and froze to death, just like they probably planned to do with your family." Marcus fixed them with an intense stare. "Finding you wasn't an accident. I've been watching their patrols, and when I saw that helicopter searching the area where you crashed, I knew they were cleaning up loose ends." Sarah's mind raced. "But we don't know anything about uranium or mining operations. We were just driving to her grandmother's house." "Maybe, Or maybe someone thinks you saw something you shouldn't have. These people don't take chances. Marcus began stuffing supplies into a backpack. Either way, staying here isn't safe anymore. They know about this cave system. It's only a matter of time before they search it thoroughly. The implications crashed over Sarah like an avalanche. They weren't just lost in a blizzard anymore. They were caught in the middle of a conspiracy that had been killing people for generations. The storm outside wasn't their only enemy. "Where can we go?" David asked. "If these people are as powerful as you say..." "There's a place," Marcus interrupted. "An old mining town about 20 miles north, supposedly abandoned, but there are people there who've been fighting this for years. People like us who've lost family to the cover-up." He shouldered his pack and checked his weapon. Outside, the wind seemed to be lessening slightly, but Sarah knew the real storm was just beginning. "We leave in an hour," Marcus said. "The blizzard's our best cover. They won't expect us to move in these conditions." As they prepared for another journey into the frozen darkness, Sarah wondered if they were walking towards salvation or deeper into a nightmare that had been decades in the making. The wind howled like a wounded beast as they pressed deeper into the ravine, following Kyle through terrain that seemed to exist beyond any map. Sarah clutched Emma closer, feeling her daughter's small body trembling despite the layers of clothing they'd wrapped around her. The mysterious herbs Kyle had given them provided warmth, but Sarah could sense their effects beginning to fade. "How much further?" David called out, his voice barely audible above the storm. Kyle paused, his pale eyes scanning the rocky walls that rose on either side of them. "Not far now, but we need to move quickly. The blizzard is getting worse, and we're not the only ones who know about this place." As if summoned by his words, a distant crack echoed through the ravine. Not the natural sound of ice or settling rock, but something else entirely. Sarah's blood chilled as she recognized the unmistakable report of a rifle. "They found us," Marcus whispered, his hand instinctively moving to the pistol hidden beneath his coat. Kyle's expression darkened. "Faster than I expected. The storm should have covered our tracks." He gestured toward a narrow opening in the rock face ahead. "There, that's our way in." The entrance was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, hidden behind a curtain of icicles that hung like prison bars. As they approached, Sarah could feel warmth emanating from within, carrying with it the scent of minerals and something else, something metallic, that made her stomach tighten with anticipation and dread. Another gunshot rang out, closer this time. Voices carried on the wind, harsh and urgent. Sarah caught fragments. "Tracks lead this way, and can't let them reach." "Inside now!" Kyle commanded, pushing them toward the opening. David went first, helping to guide Emma through the narrow gap. Sarah followed, gasping as she emerged into a vast cavern that defied every expectation. The walls gleamed with an otherworldly luminescence, patches of some phosphorescent mineral casting an eerie blue-green glow throughout the space. But it was what lay scattered across the cavern floor that made her legs nearly give out beneath her. Gold. More gold than she had ever imagined could exist in one place. Nuggets the size of her fist lay scattered like ordinary stones. Veins of precious metal snaked through the walls like frozen lightning, and deeper in the cavern, she could see the dark mouths of tunnels leading further into the mountain's heart. "Dear God," David breathed, his engineering mind clearly struggling to process the magnitude of what they were seeing. "The Lost Mackenzie Mine," Marcus said quietly. "It really exists." Kyle nodded grimly. "My great-grandfather was one of the original miners before the cave in that supposedly buried it forever. But that was no accident. The mine owners decided it was easier to hide the truth than deal with the legal complications of such a massive find on disputed land." Emma's voice was small but filled with wonder. "It's like a fairy tale." "Fairy tales don't usually involve people willing to murder entire families," Kyle replied, moving deeper into the cavern with practiced ease. "The men hunting you aren't just corporate security. They represent interests that have spent over a century keeping this place secret." Sarah's mind raced as the implications crashed over her. This wasn't just about David's geological survey or even the land rights Marcus had been investigating. This was about a treasure that could reshape the entire regional economy, controlled by people who had already proven they would kill to protect it. A new sound reached them from outside, the rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors fighting against the storm. "They're bringing reinforcements," Marcus said, checking his weapon. "How many ways out of here?" Kyle led them past towering formations of crystal and gold toward the rear of the cavern. "Several. But they all require choices you may not be prepared to make." "What kind of choices?" David demanded. "The kind that determine whether you're victims or players in this game." Kyle stopped beside what looked like an old mining cart, its wooden sides rotted but its metal wheels still gleaming. "I can get you out of here safely, but once we leave, you'll know the location of the most valuable secret in the territory. That makes you dangerous to very powerful people." The helicopter sound grew louder, joined now by the echo of voices from the cavern entrance. Sarah realized their pursuers had found the opening. "Or," Kyle continued, his pale eyes reflecting the cavern's ethereal glow, "you can help me do what my family has been planning for generations. Take back what was stolen and expose the truth." Emma tugged at Sarah's sleeve. "Mama, what does he mean?" Before Sarah could answer, the sharp beam of a tactical flashlight cut through the cavern's natural luminescence, followed by the harsh voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "End of the line. Come out slowly with your hands visible." Kyle smiled, but there was nothing comforting in the expression. "Time to choose," he whispered. The radio crackled to life at dawn, Marcus Chen's voice cutting through the static like a blade. They found Henderson's body 3 miles from the cabin. Single gunshot to the head. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as she clutched the handheld device. Beside her, Tom's jaw clenched, while Emma and Jake huddled closer together on the makeshift bed. Kai stood motionless by the window, his young face etched with a maturity that no child should possess. "There's more," Chen continued. "Satellite imagery shows at least 6 figures moving up the mountain toward your position. They'll reach you within hours." Tom snatched the radio. "What about the extraction? You promised—" "Weather's still too rough for helicopters. Ground teams can't make it through the passes. You're on your own until this storm breaks." The transmission ended in hollow silence. Sarah watched her children's faces crumble as the reality settled in. They were trapped with killers closing in and a fortune in gold that might as well have been cursed. Kai moved away from the window with fluid grace. "There's another way." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "The mine has 3 entrances. The main shaft where my grandfather hid the gold, the ventilation tunnel we used yesterday, and—" He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "The water tunnel." Tom frowned. "Water tunnel?" "It connects to an underground river that flows down the mountain. My grandfather used it to transport ore when the main roads were blocked." Kai's eyes held secrets older than his years. "It's dangerous. The current is strong, and the tunnel floods completely during heavy snowmelt, but the storm has kept the water level low." Emma's voice was small. "How dangerous?" Kai looked directly at her, his honesty brutal. "Some who entered never came out. But staying here means certain death when those men arrive." Sarah felt the familiar weight of impossible choices. Every decision seemed to lead deeper into nightmare, but movement was better than waiting for execution. "How long is the tunnel?" 2 miles underground. Then it opens into Cascade Creek about halfway down the mountain. From there, it's another mile to the old logging road where vehicles can reach. Tom was already moving, gathering their meager supplies. "We'll take our chances with the water. How do we get to this tunnel?" "Through the mine. We have to go back." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Their salvation lay in returning to the place that had started this nightmare. But as she helped her children prepare for what might be their final gamble, she realized the gold had never been their real discovery. The true treasure was the strange boy who'd emerged from the storm like a guardian angel, carrying knowledge that might save their lives. They moved through the forest like ghosts, Kai leading them along hidden paths, that seemed to exist only in his memory. The snow had stopped, but the wind still howled through the pines, masking their footsteps. Sarah kept glancing back, expecting to see armed figures materializing from the white wilderness. The mine entrance loomed ahead, dark and forbidding. Kai paused at the threshold, pulling out a waterproof bag Sarah hadn't noticed before. Inside were headlamps and what looked like climbing equipment. "My grandfather prepared for everything," he explained, distributing the gear. "The tunnel entrance is past the gold chamber, deeper in the mine than we went before." They descended into darkness, their lights creating dancing shadows on the rock walls. The temperature dropped noticeably as they moved deeper, and Sarah could hear water somewhere in the distance, a rushing sound that grew louder with each step. The gold chamber appeared in their lights, like a fever dream, bars and coins glinting with their own inner fire. Jake started toward the treasure, but Kai caught his arm. "Leave it. Gold is heavy, and we'll need every advantage in the water." Tom grabbed a single bar anyway, stuffing it into his jacket. "Insurance," he muttered when Sarah gave him a look. Beyond the chamber, the mine shaft narrowed, and the sound of rushing water became deafening. They rounded a bend, and their lights revealed a sight that stopped them cold, a circular opening in the rock floor with black water visible 20 feet below, moving with frightening speed. "That's our exit?" Emma's voice cracked with fear. Kai was already rigging ropes around a natural outcropping. "We go together, staying connected. The current will carry us, but we have to be ready to grab the exit ledge when we reach it. Miss it, and the tunnel continues another mile underground with no air pockets." Sarah stared into the rushing darkness and felt her mother's instinct screaming warnings. But behind them lay certain death, while ahead offered at least a chance. She reached for the rope, her hands steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Together," she said, looking at each of her children. "Whatever happens, we stay together." The sound of approaching voices echoed from the mine entrance above, and Sarah knew their time had run out. The abandoned mining office sat like a tomb in the pre-dawn darkness, its windows reflecting nothing but black ice. Sarah pressed her face against the frost-covered glass, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. 3 hours had passed since Marcus and Elena disappeared into the forest, and the silence was eating at her nerves. "They should be back by now," she whispered, her breath fogging the window. Behind her, David adjusted his rifle strap and checked his ammunition for the 3rd time. "Give them another hour. Marcus knows these woods better than anyone." But Sarah heard the uncertainty in his voice. They all knew the consortium's men were out there, circling like wolves. The fake coordinates Marcus had planted might buy them time, but not much. These weren't ordinary mercenaries. They were professionals who'd killed for far less than the fortune hidden in these mountains. A branch snapped outside. David raised his weapon instantly, finger hovering over the trigger. Sarah flattened herself against the wall, heart hammering against her ribs. Through the window, shadows moved between the trees, too deliberate to be animals. "How many?" David breathed. "At least 3. Sarah's voice was barely audible. "Maybe more." The radio on David's belt crackled to life. A voice cut through the static, cold, authoritative, and entirely too close. "We know you're in there. Send out the boy and the documents, and the rest of you walk away alive." David's knuckles went white around his rifle. Sarah recognized the voice from the phone calls that had started this nightmare. Henderson, the consortium's head of security, the man who'd ordered her father's murder. "They're bluffing," Sarah whispered. "They need us alive to find the real cachet." But even as she said it, she wondered if it was true. The documents Marcus had shown them contained enough information to eventually locate the hidden fortune, even without their help. The consortium might decide that eliminating witnesses was worth the extra effort. Another voice joined Henderson's, younger, more nervous. "Sir, we've got movement on the South Ridge, multiple heat signatures heading this way." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Marcus and Elena, or more consortium forces?" Henderson's response was sharp. "How many?" "Unclear." The storm's interfering with our equipment. Through the static, Sarah caught fragments of heated discussion. The consortium team was splitting up, some to investigate the approaching figures, others to maintain position around the mining office. It was exactly the kind of division Marcus would try to exploit. The radio went silent. Minutes crawled by like hours. Sarah found herself counting heartbeats, measuring time by the rhythm of fear coursing through her veins. David had moved to a different window, his rifle tracking shadows that might or might not be real. Then the shooting started. Muzzle flashes lit up the forest like deadly fireflies, rapid bursts of light, followed by the crack of gunfire echoing off the mountain slopes. Sarah heard shouts, orders being barked through the static-filled radios the consortium men carried. "That's Marcus," David said with grim certainty. "He's drawing them away from us." But the plan was falling apart. Instead of pursuing the decoy signals Marcus had set up, Henderson's team was engaging directly. Someone had figured out the deception, or gotten lucky, or Sarah's blood went cold at the thought, captured Elena and forced the truth from her. The gunfire intensified, growing closer. Through the window, Sarah saw a figure stumbling through the snow, one of the consortium men clutching his shoulder, dark stains spreading across his tactical gear. He spoke urgently into his radio, words lost in the distance, but his panic unmistakable. "We need to move," David said. "Now, while they're distracted." Sarah grabbed her pack, mind racing through their options. The emergency exit Marcus had shown them led to a maintenance tunnel that connected to the main mine shaft. From there, they could reach the hidden cache. If Marcus's directions were accurate, if the tunnel wasn't T-collapsed, if they could navigate it in the dark without getting lost in miles of abandoned workings. Too many ifs. But staying meant certain death. They slipped out the back as gunfire continued to rage in the forest. The maintenance tunnel was exactly where Marcus had said it would be, concealed behind a rusted sheet of corrugated metal. David pried it open, revealing a black mouth that seemed to swallow their flashlight beams. "Stay close," he whispered, "and pray Marcus knows what he's talking about." The tunnel stretched ahead into darkness, water dripping from unseen heights, the air thick with the smell of rust and decay. Behind them, the sounds of battle grew fainter, but never disappeared entirely. Sarah tried not to think about Marcus and Elena, tried to focus on putting one foot in front of the other. Somewhere in this mountain was a fortune worth killing for, but as they descended into the abandoned mine's depths, Sarah wondered if they would live long enough to find it, or if the mountain would simply claim 4 more victims to add to its collection of buried secrets. The abandoned mining camp materialized through the swirling snow like a ghost town risen from the grave. Weathered wooden structures leaned against each other for support, their roofs sagging under decades of accumulated snowfall. Marcus led them between the skeletal remains of what had once been a thriving operation, his movements purposeful despite the deteriorating conditions. "This way," he called over the howling wind, gesturing toward a partially collapsed building at the camp's center. "The entrance is hidden beneath the old assay office." Sarah pulled Emma closer as they navigated the treacherous footing. The girl had barely spoken since their escape from the cave, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and exhaustion that made Sarah's heart ache. Behind them, David struggled to keep pace, his injured leg leaving a faint trail of blood droplets in the snow. The assay office looked ready to collapse at any moment, its walls warped and windows long since shattered. But as Marcus approached what appeared to be a solid wooden floor, he began clearing away debris with practiced efficiency. Beneath layers of rotted planks and accumulated dirt, the dull gleam of metal became visible. "My great-grandfather wasn't the only one who knew about the gold," Marcus explained as he worked. "The mining company found traces of it back in the 20s, but they couldn't locate the main vein. They gave up after 3 workers died in cave-ins, but not before they built this." He pulled away the last of the concealing material, revealing a heavy steel trapdoor set into the ground. The sound of helicopter rotors suddenly cut through the storm's fury, growing louder with each passing second. Marcus froze, his hand on the trapdoor's handle. They found us faster than I expected. David limped forward, peering up through the falling snow. How many aircraft do these people have? Enough, Marcus replied grimly. He yanked on the handle, and the trapdoor opened with a metallic screech that made them all wince. Get down there, now! Sarah didn't hesitate. She lowered Emma into the darkness first, then dropped down herself onto what felt like solid stone. The others followed quickly, with Marcus coming last and pulling the trapdoor shut above them just as the helicopter's searchlight began sweeping the camp. In the sudden darkness, the sound of their breathing seemed unnaturally loud. Marcus fumbled with something, and then a small LED flashlight clicked on, casting dancing shadows on the walls of what was clearly a hand-carved tunnel. The miners used this to move equipment between different sections of the operation, Marcus whispered. But they never realized they were tunneling right past the biggest gold deposit in the territory. The tunnel stretched ahead of them, disappearing beyond the reach of Marcus's light. The walls showed tool marks from decades past, and here and there rusted rails still ran along the floor where ore carts had once traveled. Water dripped steadily from somewhere ahead, each drop echoing in the confined space. Above them, heavy footsteps began moving across the floor of the assay office. Sarah instinctively pulled Emma against her, covering the girl's mouth with her hand. The men were searching methodically, their boots creaking on the old floorboards. Spread out, came a muffled voice from above. Check every building. They couldn't have gone far in this storm. Marcus motioned for them to follow him deeper into the tunnel. They moved as quietly as possible, but every footstep seemed amplified in the narrow space. Emma stumbled once, catching herself against the wall with a small gasp that made everyone freeze. For several heartbeats, they waited in absolute silence, listening for any indication they'd been heard. When no immediate response came from above, they continued forward. The tunnel began to slope downward, and the air grew noticeably warmer. Strange mineral formations jutted from the walls, catching Marcus's light and throwing it back in fractured patterns. "How much further?" David whispered, his voice tight with pain. "Not far," Marcus replied. "There's a natural cavern system about 50 yards ahead. The miners broke into it by accident and found something they weren't expecting." The tunnel suddenly opened into a vast underground chamber that swallowed Marcus's small light completely. He played the beam across the walls, revealing a space so large it seemed to stretch beyond the light's reach. But it was the far wall that made them all gasp in unison. Gold. Not just veins or deposits, but sheets of the precious metal running through the rock like frozen lightning. The formation was so extensive and pure that even Marcus's weak flashlight made it gleam like captured sunlight. "This is what they're willing to kill for," Marcus said quietly. "My family has been guarding this secret for 4 generations, waiting for the right time to reveal it. But those men up there represent interests that would rather see us all dead than lose control of what they think is rightfully theirs." Emma pressed closer to Sarah, staring at the incredible sight. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Beautiful and deadly," Sarah replied, understanding now why their pursuers had been so relentless. This wasn't just about money, it was about power on a scale that could reshape the entire region. The cabin's warmth felt like a lie now that Marcus knew what lurked in the darkness beyond its walls. He pressed his eye to the crack in the shuttered window, watching shadowy figures move between the trees. They'd found the place faster than he'd expected, but then again, Crane Industries had resources he'd underestimated for years. "How many?" Sarah whispered, her breath visible in the suddenly cold air as the fire began to die. "6 that I can see, maybe more." Marcus stepped back from the window, his hand instinctively moving to the hunting knife at his belt. "They're surrounding us." Tom held Emma closer, the little girl finally asleep despite the tension crackling through the room. "We can't stay here. If they're willing to kill for that map, they won't hesitate to—" A loud crack echoed through the night as something heavy struck the cabin's outer wall, then another. The sound of systematic destruction. "To tunnel," Marcus said suddenly, his eyes lighting up with desperate hope. "There's an old mining tunnel that runs beneath this ridge. My grandfather showed it to me when I was Emma's age. Where? Sarah was already moving, gathering their meager supplies. Marcus knelt beside the stone hearth, running his hands along the rough-hewn rocks until he found what he was looking for. With a grinding sound, a section of the floor stones shifted, revealing a dark opening that exhaled the musty scent of earth and age. It comes out near the old mill, about 2 miles down the valley. If we can reach it— The front door exploded inward, in a shower of splinters and snow. 3 men in tactical gear burst through, their weapons sweeping the room with practiced efficiency. But they found only dying embers and the whisper of cold air rising from an empty hole in the floor. Marcus led them through the tunnel's cramped darkness, his childhood memories guiding each step. The passage was barely wide enough for Tom's shoulders, and ice-slicked rocks made every footfall treacherous. Behind them, shouts echoed down from the cabin as their pursuers discovered the escape route. "They'll follow us," Tom panted, struggling to keep up while carrying Emma. "Not all of them," Marcus replied grimly. "Crane's men don't know these mountains like I do, but some will try." The tunnels stretched endlessly ahead, a throat of stone that seemed to swallow their flashlight beam. Water dripped from overhead, each drop landing with a sound like a countdown timer. Marcus tried to calculate how much of a head start they had, but the mathematics of survival had too many variables. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, they reached a junction where 3 passages branched off into darkness. Marcus paused, studying the walls where his grandfather had carved directional symbols decades ago. "Which way?" Sarah asked, glancing nervously back the way they'd come. Marcus was about to answer when the sound of boots on stone echoed from behind them. Their pursuers had entered the tunnel system. "This way," he whispered, choosing the leftmost passage. "But we need to move faster." They pushed deeper into the mountain's belly, the tunnel walls closing in around them like a fist. Emma stirred in Tom's arms, mumbling sleepily about being cold. The temperature down here was a constant just above freezing that seemed to seep through clothing and skin straight into the bone. "Marcus," Sarah grabbed his arm, stopping him. "What if we're just running toward another trap? What if Crane has people waiting at the mill too?" He looked back at her, seeing his own doubts reflected in her eyes. "Then we'll deal with that when we get there. Right now, moving forward is our only option." But even as he said it, he wondered if they were simply choosing the manner of their death rather than avoiding it entirely. The map in his jacket pocket seemed to burn against his chest, that piece of paper that had turned their fight for survival into something much more dangerous. They pressed on through the labyrinth, Marcus making split-second decisions at each intersection based on half-remembered childhood adventures. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter, suggesting that their hunters had chosen wrong at one of the junctions. Small victories, Marcus thought, but he'd take whatever advantage he could get. The tunnel began to slope upward, and Marcus felt a flutter of hope. They were nearing the exit, but with that hope came a new fear: what waited for them in the world above? Crane's reach extended far beyond these mountains, and they were carrying something that powerful people had already killed to protect. "Almost there," he whispered, as much to convince himself as to reassure the others. The darkness ahead seemed absolute, but Marcus knew that somewhere in that black void lay either their salvation or their doom. In these mountains, the difference between the two was often just a matter of perspective. The helicopter's rotors churned through the mountain air as Elena pressed her face against the cold window, scanning the treacherous terrain below. Somewhere in that maze of snow-covered ridges and hidden valleys, Marcus and the children were running for their lives. "There!" she shouted over the engine noise, pointing to a thin line of smoke rising from behind a rocky outcropping. "That has to be them." The pilot, a grizzled ex-military man named Hayes, who owed Marcus more favors than he could count, banked hard toward the signal. "Landing's going to be rough in this wind," he warned, "and we won't have long before Kellerman's people spot us." Elena checked her weapon one more time, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd been tracking Kellerman's movements through her remaining contacts in the agency, and what she'd discovered had chilled her more than the mountain air. The man had gone completely rogue, assembling a private army of mercenaries willing to do anything for the right price. The Hartwell fortune had driven him past the edge of sanity. As the helicopter descended, Elena could make out figures emerging from behind the rocks. Marcus's tall frame was unmistakable, and relief flooded through her as she counted 3 smaller shapes. The children were alive. The skids had barely touched the snow when Elena leaped out, running toward Marcus through the rotor wash. He caught her in a fierce embrace, his face haggard with exhaustion and worry. "How did you find us?" he asked, shouting over the noise. "Your mountain boy," she replied, pulling back to look into his eyes. "Aspen's been leaving markers only someone with his knowledge would know how to read. Trail blazes, rock cairns. He's been guiding you toward extraction points." Marcus turned to look at Aspen with new understanding. The boy stood apart from the group, his strange pale eyes fixed on the surrounding peaks with an intensity that made Elena's skin crawl. "They're coming," Aspen said quietly, his voice somehow carrying clearly despite the helicopter's roar. "3 vehicles on the North Trail. We have maybe 10 minutes. Sam and Lucy huddled close to their father, their faces pale but determined. They'd been through too much to break now, Elena realized. Whatever innocence they'd had before this nightmare began was gone forever. "The cave system Aspen told us about," Marcus said urgently. "It leads to the old mining tunnels where the gold is hidden. If we can reach it—" "No," Elena cut him off. "That's exactly what Kellerman expects you to do. He's been studying the geological surveys, the mining records. He knows about those tunnels." Hayes appeared at her shoulder, his expression grim. "We need to move, now. I've got fuel for maybe 20 minutes of flying time, and there's weather moving in from the west that's going to ground us permanently." Elena looked between Marcus and the children, her mind racing through possibilities. None of them were good. "There's something else," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I know why Kellerman is so desperate to find that gold. It's not just about the money." Marcus frowned. "What do you mean?" "The Hartwell fortune. It was never just gold. Your grandfather was involved in something during the war, something classified that's still buried in government files. That gold was payment for services rendered to people who officially never existed." The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. "You're saying—" "I'm saying that gold is evidence of war crimes, conspiracy, things that could bring down some very powerful families if it ever came to light. Kellerman isn't working alone. He's got backing from people who can't afford to let that truth surface." Aspen suddenly stiffened, his head tilting as if listening to something none of them could hear. "They're closer. 5 minutes now." Elena made her decision. "Hayes, can you get the children out? Just them?" The pilot nodded grimly. 2 passengers. I can make it to the ranger station before the storm hits." "No," Sam said firmly, stepping forward. "We're not leaving Dad." "Listen to me," Elena said, kneeling to meet the boy's eyes. "Your father and I can move faster without you. And if something happens to us, you and Lucy are the only ones who know the truth about what's really buried up here." Lucy grabbed her brother's hand, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I don't want to go." Marcus knelt beside Elena, pulling both children into his arms. "You have to. For me. For your mother's memory. Promise me you'll tell this story no matter what happens." The sound of approaching engines echoed off the mountain walls, growing louder by the second. Aspen was already moving, gathering supplies with an efficiency that spoke of years surviving in this harsh landscape. "Time's up," Hayes called out. "Whatever we're doing, we do it now." Elena watched as Marcus kissed his children goodbye, possibly for the last time. Then the helicopter was lifting off again, carrying Sam and Lucy to safety while she, Marcus, and the mysterious mountain boy faced an impossible choice: run toward the hidden fortune that had already cost so many lives, or make their final stand in the unforgiving wilderness. The hidden chamber felt impossibly small as Marcus Harrington's men flooded through the entrance, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness like accusing fingers. Elena pressed herself against the cold stone wall, her heart hammering as she counted at least 6 figures in tactical gear. Behind her, she could hear David's labored breathing and feel Jake's trembling hand clutching her sleeve. "Well, well." Harrington's voice echoed off the ancient walls as he stepped into view, his expensive coat now torn and mud-stained from the treacherous climb. "The famous Kellerman family. You've led us quite a chase." Thomas emerged from the shadows near the back wall, his rifle raised but useless against the odds. His eyes met Elena's briefly, and she saw something there she'd never seen before: uncertainty. For days, this mysterious boy had seemed to know exactly what to do, where to go, how to survive. Now, trapped in this stone tomb with their enemies, even he looked lost. "Where is it?" Harrington demanded, his gaze sweeping across the carved walls and ancient symbols. "The map led us here, but I don't see any treasure." Elena's mind raced. The leather pouch containing the real location, the coordinates to the actual cache, was still hidden in her jacket. This chamber, despite its impressive appearance, was just another decoy. Thomas had explained it during their climb. His ancestor had been paranoid, creating multiple false locations to throw off treasure hunters. But they were running out of time and options. "There is no treasure here," Thomas said quietly, lowering his rifle. "This is just an old mine shaft that collapsed decades ago." One of Harrington's men stepped forward, his weapon trained on Thomas. "The kid's lying. Has to be. Why else would they come all this way?" Harrington studied the walls more carefully, running his fingers along the carved symbols. "These markings, they're deliberate, intentional." His eyes narrowed as he turned back to them. "You know something, all of you." David attempted to step forward, his injured leg nearly buckling. "Look, whatever you think we know, we don't. We're just trying to survive. Our car broke down and—" "Spare me the innocent family routine," Harrington cut him off. "I know you took something from that motel room. I know you've been following a trail. And I know this boy," he gestured toward Thomas, "isn't some random Good Samaritan who happened to find you in the storm." The tension stretched taut as a wire. Elena could feel Jake pressing closer to her, his small body shaking with fear. She thought of the coordinates hidden against her chest, of the real location still waiting somewhere in these mountains. Even if they died here, Harrington wouldn't find what he was looking for. "You're right," Thomas said suddenly, his voice carrying a strange calm. "I'm not random. And there is treasure, just not here." Elena's blood turned to ice. What was he doing? Harrington smiled coldly. "Now we're getting somewhere." "Where?" Thomas glanced at Elena, and she saw something flicker in his eyes, a message she couldn't quite read. "The real cache is hidden in Devil's Canyon, about 3 miles north. This chamber was just a way station, a place to rest before the final push." "Thomas, no," Elena whispered, but he continued. "My great-grandfather was paranoid about people following the trail, so he created false leads. This is one of them. The real location requires special knowledge to access." Harrington's eyes gleamed with avarice. "What kind of special knowledge?" "The kind that dies with me if you kill us now," Thomas replied evenly. The standoff stretched endlessly. Elena could hear the wind howling outside the chamber, could feel the weight of stone and earth above them. They were so deep in the mountain now, so far from any hope of rescue. Even if they somehow escaped, the storm was still raging. "Here's what's going to happen," Harrington said finally. "You're going to take us to this Devil's Canyon, all of you. And if you're lying, if this is another dead end—" He let the threat hang unfinished. "And if we cooperate?" David asked. "Then maybe you live long enough to see your family again." Harrington's smile was predatory, though I wouldn't count on it. One of his men moved to bind their hands with zip ties. As the plastic bit into Elena's wrists, she felt the leather pouch shift slightly against her ribs. The real coordinates, Thomas, had given Harrington a false location, buying them time. But time for what? Even if Devil's Canyon was 3 miles away, even if they could somehow overpower 6 armed men, the storm would kill them long before they reached safety. Thomas caught her eye again as they were herded toward the chamber entrance. This time his message was clearer: trust me. But as they stepped back into the howling wind and driving snow, Elena wondered if trust was enough. The mountain had already claimed so many lives protecting its secrets. Now it might claim theirs too. The helicopter blades cut through the morning air with a rhythmic thrum that echoed off the canyon walls. Sarah pressed her face against the cold window, watching the wilderness shrink beneath them as they rose above the tree line. Beside her, Marcus clutched a leather satchel containing the evidence that would bring down Senator Harrison's entire operation, photographs, documents, and recordings that painted a picture of corruption stretching back decades. "There," the pilot called over the engine noise, pointing toward a distant plume of smoke. "That's the ranger station. 20 minutes out." Elena squeezed her husband's hand while Danny pressed against her other side, his eyes wide with wonder at the aerial view. They were all wrapped in emergency blankets, but the helicopter's heating system felt like paradise after their ordeal in the mountains. Sarah's satellite phone buzzed. Agent Martinez's voice crackled through the static. "Sarah? Thank God, we've got teams moving on all of Harrison's associates. The safe house location you provided, we found 3 more bodies there. This goes deeper than we thought." "How deep?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Congressional level, maybe higher." The mining rights Kai's grandfather discovered weren't just valuable, they were sitting on one of the largest rare earth deposits in North America, worth billions, especially with the new green energy initiatives. Sarah glanced at Kai, who sat quietly in the corner, his grandfather's journal open on his lap. The old leather binding looked fragile in the harsh helicopter lighting, but the secrets it contained had already changed everything. "The boy's testimony will be crucial," Martinez continued. "His grandfather documented everything: payoffs, threats, the murders of other tribal elders who wouldn't cooperate. Harrison's been systematically eliminating anyone who could challenge his claim to that land." Through the headset, Sarah heard the pilot reporting their position to air traffic control. The normal world was reasserting itself with every mile they flew from the mountains, but she knew the real battle was just beginning. Harrison had resources, connections, and decades of practice at making problems disappear. Marcus leaned over, his voice barely audible above the engine. "The Harrison Family Trust owns shell companies in 7 states. I traced the money trail. They've been buying up adjacent properties for years, planning to strip mine the entire region once they cleared the legal obstacles, which included murdering anyone who stood in their way," Sarah said grimly. A new voice cut through the radio chatter, sharp, authoritative, and chillingly familiar. Senator Harrison himself somehow patched into their frequency. "Miss Chen, I believe you have something that belongs to me." The pilot's hands tightened on the controls. Sarah grabbed the radio. "The only thing that belongs to you, Harrison, is a prison cell." Harrison's laugh was cold. "You're flying through restricted airspace, Miss Chen. Tragic accidents happen in these mountains every winter. Helicopter crashes, equipment failures. The wilderness can be so unforgiving." Sarah's blood turned to ice as she spotted another aircraft rising from behind a ridge ahead of them. Sleek, black, military-grade, and closing fast. "Evasive maneuvers," she shouted to the pilot, who was already banking hard to the left. The helicopter shuddered as they dove toward a narrow canyon. Behind them, the black aircraft followed with predatory precision. Through the chaos, Sarah heard Kai's voice, calm and steady despite the terror around them. "There," he said, pointing toward a series of caves carved into the canyon wall. "My grandfather showed me thermal vents. The helicopter's heat sensors won't work near them." The pilot didn't hesitate, diving toward the cave opening with a skill that spoke of military training. The rotor wash echoed off stone walls as they threaded through the narrow passage, emerging into a hidden valley wreathed in steam from natural hot springs. Their pursuer had vanished, unable to follow through the treacherous passage. "How did you know about this place?" Marcus asked Kai. My grandfather brought me here when I was small. He said these mountains hold many secrets, some worth dying for, others worth living for. He taught me the difference. Sarah's phone crackled to life again, this time with good news. Martinez's voice was triumphant. Harrison's in custody. We moved the moment his aircraft violated federal airspace and threatened civilians. The recording of his threats was all we needed. As they flew toward safety, Sarah watched the mountains recede behind them. The ancient peaks held their secrets close, but this time the wilderness had protected those who deserved protection and exposed those who deserved justice. Kai closed his grandfather's journal and looked out at the vast landscape below. He would have been proud, he said quietly. The land remembers everything, and sometimes it fights back. The ranger station appeared ahead, surrounded by federal vehicles and news crews. The story was far from over, but for the first time since this nightmare began, Sarah believed they might actually survive to tell it.